Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the Book by Book blog, and I'm here today with my November wrap-up, which is also my nonfiction November wrap-up, because I read almost all nonfiction last month. As a reminder, here on BookTube, Nonfiction November was hosted by a book Olive, and she had 4 different categories or themes for nonfiction books: record or record, element, border, and secret. So I'll mention those as I go through. I'm going to try to do this a little more quickly than I usually do. Thank you very much for anyone who left feedback last month. And I'm going to try something new. If I can figure out how to do it, I'll include bookmarks so that you can go to the part that you want to hear. Okay, so let's jump in. The first book that I finished in November was actually a holdover from the RIP Challenge in October, and that was the Hotel Neversink by Adam O'Fallon Price. I really enjoyed this historical family drama following multiple generations of a family that also includes a mystery and where the setting is a huge part of the story. It takes place at a hotel in the Catskills, the kinds of resorts that were very popular, like in the 50s, the 60s, kind of had their heyday and then declined in later years. That's the sort of hotel that the Hotel Neversink is. It's in the Catskills. It's owned by the Sikorsky family, and it's a really unique novel in that each chapter takes place in a different year and follows a different character. So each chapter is named by the character and the year. So it runs from 1950 through 2012. It follows multiple generations of the Sikorsky family as they take over management of the hotel. Some chapters are from family members, some are from staff who worked at the hotel for many years, some are from guests who stayed at the hotel, and these different perspectives all weave together to tell a really interesting and engaging story about the family, about the hotel. The mystery at the center is that back in 1950, a child disappeared from the hotel, one of the guests. And over the years, both at the hotel and in the surrounding town, other children disappear. So that's the mystery at the center of it. But it's also all about this family and in the hotel itself. So I really enjoyed The Hotel Neversink by Adam O'Fallon Price. And then I fully jumped into Nonfiction November. My first audio for Nonfiction November was These Precious Days by Ann Patchett. I really enjoy Ann Patchett's novels. I think I've read Bel Canto. I listened to The Sense of Wonder and The Dutch House on audio. Really enjoyed all of those. And I definitely want to read more now. This is her memoir. It's actually a collection of essays, but all taken together, it does form a memoir of her life from childhood through the present day. Many of the essays in this collection had been published previously in various places, but she says they were all updated and edited and renewed for this collection. And I loved every single one of them. And I loved listening to this on audio because she reads it herself. Many of the essays are warm and moving, but some are very funny. I loved the variety here. She talks about everything from her love for her father and her 2 stepfathers to caring for them when they were older and dying. She talks about her love for Snoopy and the Peanuts when she was a little kid, which I could very much relate to. She talks about her life as a writer. One essay is all about the covers of her books and how each one came to be and what she thought of each one, which was really interesting as a reader. And the last essay in the book, I think it's the last one, Suki, is all about her remarkable friendship with this extraordinary woman. It's a long, convoluted story, but Suki was Tom Hanks' assistant. And through a series of events, she ended up living with Anne and her husband to get cancer treatment in Nashville. And that she moved in March 2020. So you know what happened next, the pandemic. So it's the longest essay in the collection, also the most moving and powerful, just a beautiful retelling of her friendship with this remarkable woman. So that's just a sampling of the wonderful essays in this collection. I highly recommend These Precious Days by Ann Patchett, and especially on audio. My first nonfiction book in print for Nonfiction November was Walden by Henry David Thoreau. I was inspired to read Walden after I read 6 Walks in the Footsteps of Henry David Thoreau by Ben Shattuck. I read this spring for Booktopia, an event I go to in Vermont every May. And Ben, this is a memoir, so it's about his own life. But as the title describes, he follows along on 6 walks, well, really 5 walks and 1 canoe trip that Thoreau describes in his own writings, in his books and in his personal journals. So this book incorporates, it's about Ben's experience, but it also incorporates excerpts from Thoreau's writing about nature. And I enjoyed that so much that I was inspired to pick up Walden and finally read Thoreau for myself. So it was a slow start, as I described in previous Friday Reads videos. The first 73 pages are a single chapter called Economy, and most of it is a rant. Thoreau just goes off on modern life and, how people wouldn't need to spend all their lives working if they didn't buy so much frippery, as he says. It's a little too much. But anyway, that section, once I got through that, I really enjoyed the rest of the book. I don't know if you can see this from there, but I dog-eared so many pages. Not so many in the beginning, but once he actually moves into Walden, into the cabin he built himself on Walden Pond, and describes nature and the world around him, it's just what I had hoped for. It's beautiful writing. He's such a detailed observer of nature, and he describes everything from the trees to the pond to the wildlife around him in wonderful detail. He's got a sense of humor. He's just has such, you can tell he's experiencing so much joy from his surroundings. And I love the outdoors. I love spending time outside, camping or hiking when I'm able to. And he captures everything that I love about nature and the outdoors and more. He's just so good at noticing the little things. So I would recommend either skimming through or even skipping that first chapter. You won't miss much. The rest of Walden by Henry David Thoreau, I really enjoyed, and I'm glad to have read it. And I read some of it while camping, so that was even better. My next audiobook for Nonfiction November was The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. And wow, this book just blew me away. It's a memoir about the author's experience of being incarcerated on death row for 30 years when he was actually innocent. Now, there are a lot of books like this out there, unfortunately. I mean, this happens far too often. I've read other books along these lines. I read An Innocent Man by John Grisham, which is his biography of what happened to someone else, another innocent man who was given the death penalty. I listened to another audiobook, which was a first-person memoir. It wasn't about death row, though. It was a man who was wrongly accused and served decades in prison before the courts finally freed him. There is so much, though, about this story that makes it unique and powerful. So much went wrong in this guy's court case. He was, and like the main character in An Innocent Man by John Grisham, the guy wasn't actually a good guy. He had been involved in some criminal things. He didn't do the crime that they were accusing him of, and he had never murdered anyone. But, you know, here, Anthony Ray Hinton was a good guy. He had gotten in a little trouble when he was younger, and which is why he was in the system and why police picked him up so quickly. But he had completely turned his life around when he was arrested in 1985. He lived with his mother and helped take care of her in the house and yard. He had a job. He was actually at the job when the crime was committed that he was accused of. He went to church. He was really a good man. And he was kind of plucked out because he was in the system and accused of murder, not just the murder they were investigating, but 2 other murders too. There was absolutely no evidence. The evidence that was presented was falsified. Witnesses lied on the stand. I mean, the number of things that went wrong against this poor guy were just mind-boggling. And then he describes in detail his time spent on death row. And this book is not just about his case. It is also about his time on death row and the other people on death row. And that story in itself is amazing. I just can't say enough. I had heard from other booktubers about The Sun Does Shine. I think that Nikki at Red Dot Reads had mentioned it in particular, and they were so right. This is an amazing book. Everyone should read it. It was excellent on audio. It's not the author reading it, though I thought it was for like 3/4 of the book. It is written in the first person, so you feel like he is telling you his story. Just outstanding book. The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. While I was working on Walden, which took me a couple of weeks to get through, I squeezed in a short graphic novel. Not a novel, really, graphic nonfiction. We still need a better name for that. So this is intended, I think, for middle grade readers, early teens. I loved it, and my husband enjoyed it too. You know, he picked it up when he saw it lying around the house. It's in the History Comics series, and I've read others in this series and really enjoyed them. I read The Great Chicago Fire. There's one about the Jamestown Colony. These are always great. But this one, The National Parks, Preserving America's Wild Places, this could have been written just for me and my husband. We love the national parks. As I said, we love the outdoors, and especially national parks. I thought I knew a lot about the national park system, but this history lesson taught me a whole lot that I didn't know. That the parks actually began in the 1850s with the designation of Yosemite in California as a state park. And the history here, it doesn't shy away from the darker parts of our history, from the fact that all the land that the national park's on was taken from Native Americans. Some of the arguments that still continue today over how to use national federal lands, the arguments between industry and business interests versus preservation, how those things were finally resolved to some degree. It's a great story. It's narrated by an eagle, who obviously represents our national bird. And so let me show you some of the pictures. Beautiful drawings. I forgot to mention the author is Fallon Cook, and she does a beautiful job of some of this, history can be so dry sometimes, and some of this is like about bills being passed, politicians arguing, but she makes it interesting, and it's fun for kids because the eagle is narrating throughout. This Bigfoot guy is also one of the narrators. So it's interesting. It's also a whole lot of fun. And I really enjoyed learning more about my beloved national parks. Next up was a book that's embarrassingly been on my shelves for over a decade. My husband read it a long time ago when we first got it. He might have actually bought this for me. It's Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand. You've probably heard of Laura. She's also the author of Unbroken. Both Seabiscuit and Unbroken were made into fabulous movies. Highly recommend both those movies if you haven't seen them. I loved Unbroken. I think Seabiscuit sat on my shelf for so long because as much as I love Laura Hillenbrand, both her writing and her personal history, she has the same immune disorder that I have and has struggled mightily. She wrote much of Seabiscuit lying in bed on her back with her eyes closed, with a pad of paper and a pencil, because she was so horribly sick. And one of her symptoms was vertigo, so she couldn't get up. Her personal story is stunning. But she also finds these little bits of history that we've forgotten about or never knew about and brings them to glorious life. And that's what she does here. I was starting to say earlier, the reason why I didn't pick it up for so long is probably just because I thought, I'm not really interested in horse racing. But as always, Laura Hillenbrand just tells an amazing story here. And Seabiscuit was an amazing horse, not just because of his wins, but because of his challenges and his struggles. And I can see why Laura chose Seabiscuit as her subject of her first book, because Seabiscuit went through so many challenges like Laura did, and somehow kept managing to overcome them. So apparently, Seabiscuit was like the headliner in the news in the late 30s and into 1940. I think it was 39, the press said that Seabiscuit was the #1 topic covered in all the newspapers in the nation that year, more than President Roosevelt, more than Hitler, more than Mussolini. They were 2, 3, and 4. So this is a horse that was huge in popular culture at the time, but that, now never heard of unless you've read Laura's book or seen the movie. So she writes beautiful narrative fiction that is gripping. It reads like a novel. And it's not just about Seabiscuit, but also his owner, his trainer, the jockey, Red Pollard, who rode him most famously. And these people, plus the horse, were this unbelievable team. There's just so much packed into this book. It's a fascinating story for both the people and the horse. And it includes, It includes some photos. That's Seabiscuit with his trainer, Tom Smith. There's Red Pollard on top of Seabiscuit. And Red Pollard himself went through horrible challenges as well. He and Seabiscuit were like this. I mean, they went through their challenges together. They went through their wins together. It's a remarkable story, and I highly recommend it. Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand. Now, since both Walden and Seabiscuit each took me 2 weeks to read, I didn't have a lot of other time for nonfiction books in print this month, which is why I snuck in a couple of graphic nonfiction books. Besides the History Comics National Park book, I read Pinball, A Graphic History of the Silver Ball by John Chad. And this was a really fun book. Again, a whole bunch of history I did not know. I loved playing pinball when I was a teenager, like most people. Reading this book has made me want to find a pinball machine somewhere and go play. There are a lot of interesting facts in here, like the fact that pinball is derived from a game called Bagatelle from Louis XIV's court. So that goes way back to the fact that pinball was outlawed in New York City from 1942 through the 70s, which was stunning to me because I grew up in New York State and played pinball as a teenager, so in the late 70s. So this is really fascinating. As you can see, the illustrations are just lively, colorful, and it describes how pinball came to be from those early days of Bagatelle in France to the games that we know now. You know, it even touches on some of the inventors, some of the designers. That's mind blown there because that was the development of flippers, which kind of changed the game. And, you know, I had no idea there was so much controversy over pinball, but there was. So this was a really interesting and fun book, Pinball, A Graphic History of the Silver Ball by John Chad. I squeezed in one more audiobook, and that was The Reading Life, The Joy of Seeing New Worlds Through Others' Eyes by C.S. Lewis. Now, of course, I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan from the Narnia series. I loved it as a child. My second grade teacher read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe out loud to us. At the end of each day, she'd read a chapter. And that got me so into the series that I went to our school library and read every single book in the series. And then when our own sons were young, we bought a boxed set and read the entire series out loud with them. So huge fan of his from that, but I haven't read much of his other writing. So the reason why this book is short is it's just a collection of things that he wrote about reading and about books. So some of these are excerpts from articles or books or essays that he wrote. Others are just a single line or two from a letter he wrote to a friend, but they're all his thoughts on reading, which he valued very highly, and on books. I particularly liked his writings about children's books. He talks quite a bit about The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, which is one of my all-time favorites. Another book I loved as a child, and then we got a beautiful illustrated version and read it out loud to our sons. So he talks about that. He specifically talks about why children's books are not only okay for adults, but spectacular for adults. He talks about how the animal characters in The Wind in the Willows parallel human characters. He talks quite a bit, there are quite a few sections on J.R.R. Tolkien and The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, his reviews of them, his thoughts on them. Those were some of my favorite parts, but the whole thing is just a love letter to books and reading. I really enjoyed listening to The Reading Life, The Joy of Seeing New Worlds Through Others' Eyes by C.S. Lewis. So that's my November wrap-up. I would love to hear what you read last month. Let me know in the comments down below. Did you participate in Nonfiction November? What books have you been enjoying? Tell me about it down below.